I talk now, can they hear me?
Yes, you can talk now. They can hear you.
Oh, okay then.
Hi. Hello, lovely listeners. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Claire Martin, and I am the Assistant Artistic Director of Sweet Tea Shakespeare. And I am so privileged to be here with one of my dear friends and colleagues, Christopher Harris, who I will be calling Chris, regardless of what he says. Chris is coming to us live from Wales, so it is evening time over there. He is a brilliant dramaturg and theater artist who is bilingual and has specifically worked in Welsh language theater and Welsh theaters. I was fortunate enough to meet him by happenstance, basically, during in the course of doing my master's in theater directing in England. I actually shadowed the director, Katie Mitchell, as she was rehearsing an opera in Amsterdam, where Chris happened to be doing his master's in dramaturgy, and we met in the rehearsal room in the fall of 2018, and the rest is history. So, Chris, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, you're welcome. It's a pleasure.
So, first of all, just orient us. Where are you in Wales?
I thought you meant room then in the house.
You can tell us that
I
too,
could say
if
that
you
too.
wish.
I'm in the study of my home in Bridgend, which is just outside of Cardiff. It's about 30 minutes west of Cardiff. It is pretty grey today. We had rain all day yesterday, so today's been a bit gloomy. I think the weather might turn to something better tomorrow. But all good, all good. So I'm in. If your geography is not great on Wales, I'm in the south of Wales. So we are determined to be the most English part of Wales because we're the closest to the border. Yeah.
And how do you feel about that?
Oh, it's fine. It's fine. I grew up so I didn't grow up around here. I grew up in the valleys. The valleys are what we call sort of north of where I am now. So where all the old coal mining towns were established in kind of the late 1800s, and then was sort of disbanded around the 80s during the Thatcher government. I grew up in that kind of area. My parents, and as far as I'm aware, my family are all from that area as well. But I grew up in a place called Cumbran, which in English means the Valley of the Crows for some reason. And my parents still live there, but I moved here about a year ago. So
Great. Well, I think we should start with a point of connection for both of us, which is the Dutch National Theatre, where you and I met. You were working in the dramaturgy and literary management department for a production of Jennifer. You have a background in opera, and I do not. But I would love to hear a little bit about like how you, as a English and Welsh speaking Welshman, found your way to a rehearsal room in Dutch in Amsterdam, and just kind of your experience with opera more generally.
I know it's mad, isn't it? Because even to this day, I think, God, man, what happened? That was such a journey. So the long story short is, I about 3 to 4 years ago was working a job that I didn't particularly love doing, and decided that I needed some sort of drastic change in my life. And at the time, I had sort of, I guess, blossomed in the way of wanting to go see different types of theatre internationally.
Yeah.
And that's the time when I started to discover more international theatre groups like Toneel Amsterdam, who have now changed. They're now known as ITA, or International Theatre Amsterdam. Yeah. And people like the Schaubühne in Berlin. And these were companies that were all coming to places like the Barbican in London, and were doing performances that I wanted to go and see. And it was also a time where I was beginning to find my feet as an artist in Wales and begin to rediscover the potential of what Welsh language theatre can be. kind of on a European but more international level. And in 2016, wrote a sort of out of the blue email to Toneel Amsterdam, where Eva van Hove, who's now pretty much, I guess, the superstar A-list director that there is. If there's such a thing as like a real celebrity-esque theatre director, I think he's in that category.
Yeah.
And I wrote to the company and said that I'd love to come and observe some of the work. And at the time, he was directing a production called The Hidden Force. And I went and sat in on the rehearsals and spoke to him and spoke to their resident dramaturg there, and had some great conversations about what dramaturgy was and why in Wales and in the UK in particular has a very different meaning and a different understanding. And I'm sure it has a very different meaning in America as well, because I'd contest that America actually has a lot more to do with the European method of dramaturgy than they do with the British.
I would agree.
Yeah. And from that, met someone who was on the course doing international dramaturgy. So then when I came home, I decided to do a little bit more research about it and decided that this was the logical step that I wanted to do in my life and in my career, to go and move to Amsterdam for 2 years and study this course. Now, I mean, you said that I have a background in opera. It's not entirely true.
If you have a background in them, I could probably list 3 operas off the top of my head, and you can probably list hundreds.
Well, but that just comes from me being a complete nerd as well, and just absorbing information like a sponge, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm like an excited new puppy. When I find something new, then I begin to play with it all the time, and then it's the next thing that I play with. But what happened was, as part of the course in Amsterdam, which was a terrific course, mainly because of the people that I met, including yourself, on an international level, which was something far more new and exciting for me, something that I'd never really approached or experienced before, which was just to talk to different people about what they did and what their history was and their experience. And as part of that course, I had to do an internship. And the internship could be anywhere, essentially, anywhere I wanted it to be, as long as I sort of set it up myself, between myself and the institute and the tutors of the course. And at the time, Katie Mitchell, who was somebody I've always admired and respected as a director, was about to present her production of George Benjamin's opera Lessons in Love and Violence, which has a libretto by Martin Crimp. But I found out that was a repeat performance. So I went to the opera and had a fantastic conversation with, at the time, their resident dramaturg, Klaus Bertisch, who said to me, well, this is probably not the best production to work on, but she is directing a new production of Leos Janáček's opera Jenůfa. And he said, this will be a brand new production which she will work on from scratch for 6 weeks. So why don't you come and work on that with me, and we'll go from there. So that's kind of how it started. And that was my first foray into opera, through that meeting with Klaus at the Dutch National Opera. And before then had only ever seen an opera, I think, twice. Yeah. Once in Aberystwyth, which is a town in the west of Wales, from a company who I still love and admire, who is Music Theatre Wales, and then maybe something on DVD. But that was about it. So this was my first real step into the opera world. And since then, I've had a great admiration and have since luckily worked as well with many different people on an international level, which has been great. And of course, this is how we met as well. And I remember that day when we were in the rehearsal room with Katie and with Robin, her assistant, and just just chatting, right?
Yeah.
Just chatting about theatre and everything. And that evening, we went to see Simon McBurney's production of The Magic Flute, if you remember.
Yeah, it was our first day.
which to me is still it's amazing, isn't it? This is I know you're a Shakespearean company. Immediately we're talking about opera. I think it's great.
I wanted to
but
hear about it. I mean, there's so many things that I sort of wanted to interject and say, but I didn't want to interrupt the flow of your story. We should clarify the absurd irony of the fact that Katie Mitchell is a British director. She is an English woman, and the fact that you, a UK citizen, were doing a Masters of Dramaturgy internationally in Amsterdam, observing at a Dutch language opera house, the Dutch National, and that the person that you were shadowing, the rehearsal room that you were working in, was actually run by a British woman who spoke English and had translators in the room. Like, and then the fact that, you know, that's where you and I intersected. We really were like on the far edge of the, how is this possible bell curve, by the fact that we, all three of us, intersected and in the way that we did. Katie Mitchell is not Dutch, and she does not live in the Netherlands. She was there to guest direct, and it just sort of like a crazy confluence of events came together, and that is how we met. But, you know, I didn't know anything about opera. Before this experience, you didn't know that much about opera. Katie Mitchell has been directing opera for many, many years. So we really were getting to see an icon at work. And we just happened to be so fortunate that she was doing it in English, even though we were in Amsterdam at the time. But yeah.
Well, for the internship, it was it's obviously difficult because I don't speak Dutch. But the thing about opera in general, no, not at all. But the thing about opera, the advantage of working in opera is because so many people come from many different international platforms.
Yeah.
Generally, in my experience, the language of the rehearsal room is English. So what was great about that was part of the reason I chose to do my internship on that production was because Katie Mitchell was in the room, and we knew that the language of the rehearsal room would be English, because otherwise I wouldn't understand what was going on. So, but no, you're right, and she was directing an opera in Czech.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think I'd probably be right in saying she probably classes herself more as a European director now. Anyway.
Yeah.
I think she directs more in mainland Europe than she does in the UK.
True.
In more recent years. But here's an interesting segue. I think it was only her second opera that she ever directed in 1998 was actually Eunufa. So the Eunufa you and I had met on was her second production, and the first production that she directed was for Welsh National Opera. And that production was supposed to come back in September. They were doing a revival of it, but I don't know what's happening with that anymore, given the current situation. But it's a small world.
Well, speaking of segues, then let us use that as a segue, because obviously you and I are coming to each other live across the pond during a seismic moment in history. Although now that the quarantine has lasted for nearly 3 months, I don't know if we can class it as a moment anymore, as opposed to like an epoch maybe. But we are living in the strangest of times, and in America this week in particular, and last week, one of the hardest times. And I would love to hear, in the light of COVID, what theater is like in Wales and also the UK more specifically. How has our current crisis, our current pandemic, changed the landscape of theater and changed the lives of artists living there?
I think on a service level, devastatingly.
Yeah.
At the start of the lockdown in the UK, which was around the end of March, because I was in Amsterdam at the time when theatres started to close, and that was around the 13th of March. Devastating in the sense that all theatres closed, and as of yesterday, actually, a lot of theatres have announced that most of their productions will be cancelled all the way up until the end of the year. I know the Royal Shakespeare Company are praying that 2 of their productions might be able to come back in the autumn. But generally, everything is on hiatus until at least the end of the summer. Having said that, what I should say first of all is that the government subsidy for theatres is non-existent at the moment. There is no furlong scheme that will ensure the complete safety of the theatre industry, or the art sector, I should say, in the UK for the long term. In fact, an open letter went out by producer Sonia Friedman, who quite openly stated that unless significant government intervention is made now, 70% of the industry will be gone by the end of the year. Now, when you put it in that perspective, it does stop the heart a little bit. But on a more kind of micro level, what's quite remarkable is the way that people are quite quickly adapting to the situation.
Yes.
And more specifically, here is where I can talk about Wales in particular. The theatre companies that I tend to work for, which are mainly Welsh language theatres.
Hold on. You have to specify what that is. What is a Welsh language theatre?
We have several Welsh language theatre companies in Wales. We have some that specifically work in the Welsh language and some that are considered bilingual. So the ones that I have worked for extensively in the past are Theatr Genedlaethol Cymru, and Theatr Genedlaethol Cymru are our Welsh language national theatre. We have two national theatres in Wales. There's that one, and then there's the standard National Theatre of Wales. National Theatre of Wales was founded in 2010, I believe.
Wow.
Just before maybe. I think it was around 2008, actually. Sorry, 2008. Whereas the Theatr Genedlaethol Cymru was founded in 2003. So we've had a Welsh language national theatre for longer. And then there are several companies. Our primary new writing house, which is based in Cardiff, the Sherman Theatre, works bilingually. And then there are various receiving/producing houses across Wales then that work in both languages. So many of these companies have taken to the online platform in several ways. There are two ways they are doing it. So, for example, just to give one example, Theatr Genedlaethol Cymru have created something which they call Creu ar-lein, which means to make online, I guess. And this initiative is used in order to allow artists to continue working in this artistic landscape, I guess. And what that does is try and embrace technology and embrace what we can do in the online stratosphere, if you like. If they're not doing that, if theatre companies maybe don't have the resources to do that at the moment, they're at least offering some sort of resources, educational resources, or maybe taking past productions from their back catalogue and putting them on YouTube, like the National Theatre has been doing in London. So the situation is, I think, at the moment, in Wales in particular, is delicate, but I don't think it's catastrophic yet. But who knows? We'll have to see what happens. Time will tell. It depends on many factors. It depends on how much of a government initiative can be put in place in order to financially save these institutes, but also how much we as a theatre landscape in Wales are willing to change our mindsets and change the way that we do things.
Yeah.
Because it really does come from the individual, I think, right? It comes from how much we are willing to adapt to these situations. And I'm at the moment personally, I'm seeing both schools happening. I'm seeing people who are adapting quite well to these situations, and maybe some who I like to describe as a kind of bottlenecking onto the digital platform, which I don't know is healthy, to be honest. I think, in my opinion, I think what's going to ensure longevity in the theatre landscape here is by maybe taking a pause and really understanding what we need to do to organically adapt to the situation.
And we should clarify here as well for our listeners that theatre in the UK and Wales is subsidized by the government to a degree that we can barely fathom in America. There is a huge percentage of the budget of these theaters, large and small, that comes from government subsidy. And that's not to say that we don't have a few select small subsidies here in the US, but we certainly do not, our theater landscape is not propped up on funding from the government the way it is in the UK. So with everything happening with COVID, the fact that that money has dried up, it, as Chris says, is potentially catastrophic because there is because a huge percentage of their funding has just kind of been ripped. The carpet has been ripped out from under them. And in America, we're a little bit more used to fending for ourselves when it comes to funding. And so I think, you know, I've witnessed many theaters, Jack Beat and Jack Be Quick, like moving into online platforms and reconceptualizing and, you know, getting very kind of digitally creative with perhaps less of the existential dread wearing on their hearts that it may be for artists in the UK. And I think, you know, it is always, I think it's always good to take, you know, big global moments like the one that we're in right now to reflect. That's not to say that we stop entirely. And of course, you and I are doing a live podcast as a way of supplementing the cavity that we feel as a theater company, unable to make our Shakespeare plays in person the way we are used to. That doesn't mean that we're not trying. It doesn't mean that we don't have projects in the works, but this is one of the ways that we can, you know, remain connected to our mission, the mission of theater more generally, and also artists that we love and respect during this time when we can't see any of them. So I fall slightly more onto the be reflective, but don't feel like you need to be a fly in amber. But I also completely respect that, like, I'm coming at this from a distinctly American perspective, where we are not facing the collapse because of like government shutdown the way you are, you know, across the sea. And I have this sort of new radar, and I've had it since I did my master's abroad, which is I am always now thinking, how is my perspective shaped by my American identity, not just the other kind of demographical identifiers of me, but like I recognize now that like even something as simple as doing Shakespeare, it can mean cataclysmically different things depending on which country you happen to be in. So I would love to talk with you a little bit about Shakespeare, Chris, because we are a company and that is what we do. Also because you have a very sort of unique relationship to Shakespeare, being Welsh.
How's that? I mean, I've seen and experienced Shakespeare in Welsh,
right?
If that's what you mean.
That is, yes, that is exactly what I mean. And also, you have a unique relationship to the way the history is presented in Shakespeare's history plays, by virtue of being Welsh. We've had arguments about that in the past.
Well, if I mention the word Henry V, then
that's 2 words. We
might go into slightly different debate.
It's either 2 or 3 words. It's definitely not a word. But yes, I agree. We could argue about that play all day long. So what is kind of your relationship to Shakespeare? Kind of where did it begin, and what do you see as the most exciting plays? What are the plays that you keep coming back to?
Oh gosh, you know, you were saying earlier about interrupting. Like you will have to interrupt because I already am aware that I'm just spiraling into different avenues. Shakespeare. Well, if you grow up in the UK, then Shakespeare becomes a part of your educational background.
Yeah.
I think the worst thing about Shakespearean education in the UK is that it's introduced when you become your most cynical. So we tend to begin learning Shakespeare around the age of 11, 12. So when you start high school, I guess.
They call it high school.
And
we don't. We'd call it middle school.
Oh, I see. Okay, right. That's the thing that I confused. So in the UK, you'd have your primary school, which is up until about the age of 11, and then you would go into high school, or we'd call it comprehensive school. Actually, we wouldn't call it high school. So comprehensive school is between the age of 11 and 18, or 16 if you decide to leave before then, and then 16 to 18 is when you would do your what we call A levels, and then the A levels are what prepare you to go to university. Between 18 and onwards, I suppose. Anyway, sorry. What was I saying? Oh, education. So Shakespearean education. You were introduced to it from that 11-year-old age in the UK, and then if you continue to study English in your further education, or indeed theatre, then Shakespeare is always a part of that framework. So I would have been introduced to it. Even from growing up in a Welsh medium education. So my education was completely in the Welsh language, apart from English language classes, of course. And the dynamic in Wales is essentially we are a bilingual nation, but it is actually optional whether you send your child to fluent Welsh medium education or not. However, it is compulsory for every pupil in Wales up until the age of 16 to have Welsh language classes. So even if you're growing up in a English medium education, you will always have, I think it's 3 or 4 hours a week of Welsh language education anyway, which is terrific. But I was the opposite. My parents sent me and my sister to Welsh medium education. So we would have learnt Shakespeare in our theatre classes in Welsh. But then we would have, which is crazy, right? Because it can be difficult to grasp in English, let alone in Welsh. So then in English classes, we would have studied it. And then, of course, I decided to take it to my A levels when I was 16, 17, 18, and would have learnt different plays all the way through. So I think each year that I was in comprehensive school, I learnt a different Shakespeare play. So very, very young then, I used to do a lot of youth theatre. And the first play that I acted in Shakespeare would have been in university. I went to university to do my bachelor's in Aberystwyth, which I mentioned before, which is in the west of Wales. Beautiful seaside town, fantastic theatre department, still is as well. And as part of our third year presentation, there was an option to perform in a what did we call it? It wasn't just Shakespeare, but it was, call it the final third year project, if you like. But you could opt to be in a classical play, you could opt to be in a devised play, physical based play, a contemporary piece. And depending on that, there were different lecturers that were attached to direct one of those pieces. So when we had the kind of tick box, I put my name down to be in the classic play. And the classic play was always chosen based on who was in that group, I suppose.
Which I love. I think that's a smart way to do it, honestly.
I think so, because the director, Richard Cheshire, wanted to... for years, as far as I'm aware, always wanted to do the Henry VI plays, or rather the War of the Roses series, if you like. And I think the RSC are down to do a production of this by the end of the year.
They are.
So we essentially did the War of the Roses cycle, if you like, which would have been Henry VI Part 1, 2, and 3, and Richard III in a 2-hour version.
I still don't,
which was adapted by him.
I don't understand how. Like, especially if you want there to be a cogent narrative, like the character, like Richard of Gloucester, who becomes Richard III, doesn't even manifest in his full splendor in the series until like Henry VI Part 3. So, if I could go back in time and watch this production, I would have. But please continue.
Well, as far as I'm aware, we didn't have much to do with the adaptation. All I know is that we were given the full texts, and then at some point, our director did most of the dramaturgy of it and encapsulated it. But as far as I'm aware, even that was based on previous productions that had done it anyway. And I know you and I have had this conversation before. I don't think I've ever seen a company in my lifetime that's done the Henry VI plays in their entirety.
I haven't either.
Because a lot of it's boring,
Yeah.
right? So,
I would agree.
in my opinion, anyway.
Yeah, I would agree.
So I think this is why even the RSC have done the encapsulated versions.
Yeah.
We based ours on a very famous adaptation, which was I think it was for Edward Hall's company, Propeller. Do you guys know that one? Propeller, yeah, the all-male-based company in England. And so Peter Hall's son, Edward Hall, was he was the artistic director, and he might have been the founder as well. They did a famous production called Rose Rage, which was also the 4 plays encapsulated into one. But I think even they did it in maybe 2 parts where they were like 3 hours each or something. We managed to put all ours into 2 hours. And I think the way that we did it was we basically cut most of part 1, did maybe a third of part 2, and then most of part 3, and then a lot of Richard III as well. But even a lot of Richard III took a lot of butchering. Quite frankly.
That play can do with some butchering, though. To me, there's only one character who emerges as interesting in that play, and the play's like 4 hours long. So, cut with discretion. I give full license to people who want to do that. But you also, as I stare at you with this ridiculous mustache that you've grown, you also played Orlando in As You Like It. And
I did.
You have strong feelings about As You Like It, which we have never, I don't know that you and I have ever really plumbed before, but I would love to hear a little bit about your experience playing that bardic lad, and also just, what that play means to you, and perhaps the problems that you see in it.
What does it mean to me? I mean, it didn't really mean anything to me, because when it's funny, I came to it by being in it.
Right.
I'd never read it before being in it. So maybe it was the best way of experiencing it firsthand.
Sure.
Was to experience it. What's my problem with that play? I think it's like a lot of Shakespearean comedies. There's a lot of holes in it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of holes in how a lot of them end up in the forest, or how they come to certain decisions, or why some of their behavioral traits, some of the characters, I mean, why they end up doing that. It's been a while since I've read it, actually, but from what I remember, I just remember thinking you could cut the 4th act, entirely, and it would probably not make much of a difference to the plot. I think the subplot between Phoebe and, I've forgotten their name, the farmer? Phoebe and...
Sylvius?
What's his name?
Sylvius.
Yes. I mean, that subplot comes way too late. It just felt like Shakespeare needed a dramaturg when he wrote it.
That could be its own podcast series. We could talk about what would have happened if Shakespeare had a dramaturg.
Well, maybe, and I also feel like a few other Shakespeare plays as well. I feel like he's written great characters that are in the wrong play. I feel like Rosalind is one of his greatest creations, and she's in the wrong play. Yeah, so it's not one of my favorites. Orlando is a little bit like the sickly romantic hero as well. So as much as there's beautiful words to be said, you can say that about all of Shakespeare's characters, quite frankly. But it's not one of my favorites. I don't know what else to say about it, really.
Yeah, it's interesting for me, because I have read all of the plays several times, growing up, and I've studied them. As You Like It, I have never encountered artistically. I've seen it. I've seen many productions of it, but I have never been involved with a production of it. And for that reason, and that reason alone, it's always had a bit of a lure for me. It's always had like an aura of mystery that I think it doesn't for a lot of people, because for many people it is their first introduction to Shakespeare, or one of their earliest, because it's a fairly accessible comedy that can be not necessarily, but it can be relatively family friendly depending on the production. And yet I feel like I don't actually understand it because I've never worked on it. And the Shakespeare plays that I do feel like I have some deeper understanding of, they're all ones that I have worked on. And I don't know if that's a common thing for theater artists who work in classical theater to feel. I certainly don't feel like I love the plays simply because I've worked on them. There are Shakespeare plays I can't stand that I've worked on many times, like Mackers. But but I just don't get As You Like It. Like, I don't grasp it the way I do some others. So
I feel similar about it. You said about experiencing it, right? I think there's a valid point there, particularly with Shakespeare, because it's in a language that we don't know anymore and we don't speak. So to us, it almost feels alien. And yet, when you hear those words, or when you speak them more appropriately, they come alive, right? And it's the same qualm I have with Shakespearean Education, because when you're making a kid in front of 30 of his friends sit there and read a piece of Shakespeare when they might not want to at all, and you force it down their throats, then it becomes a bit of an issue. You can see why young people sort of reverted to it from a very young age, because it's taught in the wrong environment. And to be fair to most institutes in the UK, they make most of their Shakespeare productions accessible for people to watch. But the most successful times that Shakespeare is taught and experienced is when it's made relevant to now. And I think it is important that Shakespeare... it's important that Shakespeare is continued to be exploited in a way, and readdressed. And I think it's great if you can do what Lindsay Turner did and put "to be or not to be" at the beginning of Hamlet and just see what happens. Shakespeare's been dead for 500 years. He's not going to say about it.
I completely concur. Also, the only production of Hamlet I've ever wanted to do doesn't even include "to be or not to be." So that's something that I will someday have to do fisticuffs with my dramaturg over. But for right now, I just wanted to.
Can I ask you?
No,
first?
you can't. No, you can't. I'm doing it.
Uh-oh.
I have a very specific idea for this production. It's going to be great, and I'll put "to be or not to be" in the program, so anyone who wants to see the words can see them. But it will not be in the show.
Well, my question was just going to be, what do you think is Shakespeare's masterpiece?
It's not a play. Because I think that for the most part there are holes. You say there are holes in As You Like It. I would argue there are holes in all of his plays. And I think plot in Shakespeare's plays comes secondary to character. I think that I think his masterpiece is an art gallery's worth of characters who are resplendently multifaceted. That to me is an extraordinary feat. That is what I as a writer can barely scratch the surface of my admiration of his ability to craft human psychology in so many different ways and different forms. And I'm not saying there aren't issues there. I'm not saying that certainly his representation as far as the array of humans is severely limited, in large part because of the time and place from which he was writing. But I think his masterpiece is that he created so many people that 500, 400 years later still resonate as people. When we see and hear them on stage, they still feel like full humans. And that I think that's a masterpiece. So I'm going to step off my soapbox for a moment, because we need to take a moment and thank our sponsors for today's episode. So I would just like to thank from the deepest depths of my heart the Arts Council of Fayetteville and Cumberland County for endowing Sweet Tea Shakespeare with the resources to be able to create content like this that allow me to connect with brilliant theater artists like Chris across miles and miles of space, and just thank you for supporting the arts and for investing in the arts in the community. It means more than we can say. And I personally just also want to thank Jeremy Feebig and Ashanti Bennett, our artistic director and general manager, who are the pillars that hold up our institution, and certainly pillars in my life as I learn this new role. Thank you so much for everything that you do, and for enabling me to have wonderful conversations like this one. So with that, you and I can get back to arguing. But also, one thing that I would like to touch on is the fact that Welsh language Shakespeare, as you mentioned, is not only a thing, but is often taught in schools. And I know, because I asked you, you have a copy of a Welsh language Tempest, and I would love for you to share that with us.
Yeah, of course. Well, so this production was produced by the theatre company I mentioned earlier, Theatr Genedlaethol Cymru, or the Welsh National Theatre. And this production was I'm literally reading it now because I didn't know, in 2012. Now, I didn't see this production, but this is a translation by a woman called Gwyneth Lewis of The Tempest. But in Welsh, we don't actually have a direct translation for Tempest.
Right.
So we just simply know it as a storm, as we would say in Welsh. Now, what I do know about this production is it was set in a circus tent. And each year in Wales, we have this festival called National Eisteddfod. And the Eisteddfod is a celebration of Welsh culture and Welsh artistry, all in the Welsh language. And it happens around the same time every year, the kind of first or second week of August, and it moves around. Now, of course, because of our friend COVID, it has been cancelled this year. But as far as I'm aware, everything has just sort of been put on pause, and it'll all happen next year in West Wales, in a place called Tregaron, which is not far from the sea. But this production in 2012, so this would have been in the North Walian Eisteddfod, in a place called Bro Morgannwg. And what shall I do? Should I read a passage for you?
Yeah.
Or what should I say about it? All I can say about it is, I mean, it's a direct translation of the full text, as far as I'm aware. As Welsh is probably a new language to a lot of the American listeners, and I'm sure you'll have some international listeners as well. I thought I would give you the most famous speech probably from The Tempest, which is Prospero's Act 4 speech. We are such stuff as dreams are made on. I thought it was of, and then found it was on.
It's on.
So for years I was saying it incorrectly for years, but I think it's very beautifully translated, and of course I'm very biased because I've been speaking the Welsh language all my life, but the Welsh language is a very beautiful and poetic language. But this is it. Shall I? I haven't rehearsed, so so here we go. Peidiwch fy mab a chymryd atoch. Codwch eich calon, sir, oherwydd daeth I ben ein cyfeddwch nawr. Fel eich rybuddies, ysbrydion oedd yr actorion hyd y doddodd i'r awyr, i'r arwyn fain. Ac fel brethyn di sylfaen yr olygfa hon, tyrer ymestyn I fyny'r cymylau, plasau, teimla hardd, y ddeiar gron ei hun. Yn wir pob dim a etifedda, diffoddant ac fel y pasiant ansylweddol, hwn, palant a gadel pryn darth o'i hôl. Deunydd breuddwydion ydym, ynys fach yn bywyd mewn môr o gwsg. Syr, rwy'n drist. A mynydd am gwendid pen hen ŵr llawn gwau. Na hydiwch ddim fy mod i'n ddisgrell. Ciliwch imcell os gwelwch yn dda, cewch orffwys yno. Fe af am dro I derbyr terfysg yn fy meddwl. This is why I no longer act Shakespeare.
No, that was beautiful. Thank you so much. The thing that made me think as I was listening, beyond the fact that I will just always love listening to you speak Welsh, is that there is so much breath that you hear in the Welsh language, and that's partly because you have lots of sounds that sort of come from the throat, like it's I feel like I can hear breath in Welsh in a way that I can't in a lot of language. And for a character like Prospero, who is a character that, we know is near the end of his life, and who comes to understand that he is completing his arc as a human being, as a father, as a leader. He is coming to the end. And that is part of why this speech in particular is so deeply poignant and resonant, is because it feels like a farewell of sorts. And the way that I have always wanted to direct the Tempest, I say always, the way I have wanted to direct the Tempest since my father got pancreatic cancer, is I have wanted to make it explicit from the beginning that Prospero knows that he has a fatal illness. I don't know what that illness is, but he knows that he's dying. And so his bringing of the ship to the island is as much about the fact that he realizes he doesn't have much time left to make amends. And so there is a bit of self-interest, but also just kind of like there's an awareness in him that he has not passed on to his daughter, that he knows this is it. It's now or never. And when you speak it in Welsh, and I hear that breath, that sound, I think about how moving it would be to do that production in a Welsh language context, because the audience would be able to hear the effort that it takes to get those words out. There could be real experimentation with rhythm and pace. And so by the time he gets to this speech, and kind of all of his speeches in Acts 4 and 5, we could really slow that text down, and the audience would have to hear the like the breath, and the effort that it's taking him to generate that breath, because the language kind of invites us to listen to it anyway. That was really lovely. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, it's okay. I mean, what's funny is that the most famous line is probably the most beautifully translated, actually. I'll just read it again. So, Deunydd breuddwydion ydym, ynys fach yn bywyd mewn môr o gwsg. I mean, that's just, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's fun. J.R. Tolkien, when writing Lord of the Rings, based part of the Elvish language that he uses in that fictional universe from the Welsh language, as well as other stuff. So you can, if you listen to the Lord of the Rings films, you can hear that language. But it's an ancient language. It's older than English. And the Welsh people were always reciting poetry and reciting stories and singing to one another.
Yeah.
At a very early stage, so it lends itself beautifully to the language. I know there are a lot of Shakespeare enthusiasts out there, probably radicalists, who would probably contest that Shakespeare shouldn't be translated. I don't agree. Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, you think they should be translated?
I do. I think anyone who undertakes it is just incredibly, intrepidly brave, because that is I can't, I mean, now you can tell my monolingualism, like I can't even fathom the process of trying to begin to translate Shakespeare into another language. But I think if we want to say he's universal, or if we want to say that he belongs to the world, that he belongs to everyone, if we want to democratize him in that way, which that rhetoric is so often used as like virtue signaling from theaters. But if we're going to say that, then I think we have to live up to it. And I think living up to it begins with bringing it to the people who do not speak English, or do not speak English as a first language, and trying to, bring some of that magic to them in a way that they can, feel and be moved by. It's much the same as I feel about, incorporating actors with, say, hearing impairments into Shakespeare, and incorporating ASL and ESL, so that the plays can mean something new, and they can mean something specifically to communities who may feel that they are not only not represented by the plays, but also that they are shut out of the meaning. So I'm I'm all for translations. I just personally, I have no experience with it. Have you ever worked to translate Shakespeare or any playwright into Welsh just on your own as like a thought experiment?
Not so recent. I'm at the moment. I'm working on an opera libretto.
Yeah.
I'm working on Janacek's The Cunning Little Vixen, which has been quite a joy to translate, actually. And of course, that's a different ballpark because of the fact you're working with quite a strict score.
Yeah.
So what you find with that is you can create quite a literal translation that's fairly organic, but of course, at the end of the day, you have to honor Janacek's composition.
Right.
It's the whole point of it, right, with opera. So the translation does have to be sacrificed somewhat, or rather, sorry, I should say the original language has to be sacrificed somewhat in order to suit the rhythmical translation of it.
Right.
I guess to some extent Shakespeare would be the same, right? So that is the one sacrifice with the translation. But you're right, totally. I mean, listening, just reading that one speech now, the speech makes more sense to me in Welsh than it does in Shakespearean, Elizabethan English, because the Welsh has ultimately made it more accessible.
Yeah.
And of course, it's more of a cultural thing, I think, right? We can discover more things about what Shakespeare is trying to say through our own languages and our own way of communicating. It's a little bit of a different game in Wales because of the fact that we're such a bilingual nation. It's still only, I think it's around a third of the population. It might be close to a quarter now, actually, that speak the language. We're a nation of about 3 to 4 million people. And around 500,000 of us speak the language. Having said that, it's still in the DNA and in the fabric of the Welsh people because of the fact we're surrounded by it.
Yeah.
Everything is bilingual. All our road signs are bilingual.
Yeah.
So what you do find in terms of not just with Shakespeare but with theatre in general in Wales, there is quite an openness to going to see multilingual theatre, and we're getting better at how we make those accessible, mainly because of technology and how we can deliver those across to people, but also we're starting to embrace the fact that we are a bilingual nation and that Wales, as much as it's a beautiful, old traditional Celtic language, it has its flaws in the 21st century in the fact that it's adapted so much to the English language. We have this thing called Wenglish, which means essentially when you're speaking Welsh, but then occasionally you'll flip back to English.
Yeah.
So we're embracing that language as a thing in itself as well. So yeah, why not? Why not translate Shakespeare? Again, he's not going to say anything about it, is he?
Right.
So
you asked me what I think Shakespeare's masterpiece is, and I gave you a cheater's answer. But I would love to flip the question back on you. What do you think his masterpiece is, or masterpieces are? And have you encountered them as an artist?
I'm not sure I can make a fair assessment, actually, because of the fact I haven't seen all of his plays and shamedly haven't read all of them either. There's probably a good 9, 10, 11 of his plays I still haven't read fully yet. Having said that, from what I've seen and what I've experienced, and the one that's touched me the most, and the one I've always felt I can always go back and revisit and always feel that there is always a fresh interpretation to be made of it, is King Lear. And I think the beauty of King Lear is because it has such a broad range of characters. And I think you say it was a bit of a cheated answer. I don't think it was. I think you're right in terms of the characters of Shakespeare. He really did understand character. And as we know, for basic dramaturgy, character is plot, right? Plot should always come after character, certainly in my opinion. King Lear covers all grounds, all experiences, all ages. It kind of doesn't matter what age you are. You can always grasp something from King Lear.
Yeah.
I understood elements of Edgar and Edmund's frustrations from when I first began to see, when I first watched King Lear.
Yeah.
I think the first production I saw was the RSC DVD of directed by Trevor Nunn with
Yes.
Ian McKellen.
Yes.
From 2007, which I believe it did like 2 years or something. It did a 2-year tour.
Yeah.
I don't know what it was about that production that resonated so much across the globe. Nonetheless, that was the first production I had seen of it. And even, as I get older, I still find gems in King Lear, which I connect with and love and adore. And I look forward to hopefully reaching 80 years of age and being able to fully connect with what Lear is saying and what he experiences. And of course, medically, as we all become more familiar with the mind and the human body and what dementia and Alzheimer's means, there's a better understanding, I think, of what Lear is going through in that aspect.
Yeah.
And I think anybody who is a human being will understand the trauma and the fulfillment that many of those characters go through. So I think, in a nutshell, I think it's King Lear.
Yeah.
For me, it's King Lear. I loved the Tempest for the fact it's so radically different to the rest of his other plays. I can't think of any other plays that are so similar to the Tempest. It's so out there.
Yeah.
Do you think?
And even amongst the romances, it's in a sort of league of its own.
Yeah, it really is.
I struggle with it. I struggle with it because I struggle with the finality of it. I feel like if I worked on it, I would think, where do I go from here in Shakespeare? What do I work on next? There is something that feels just like so final about that play. And that breaks my heart. In many ways, it breaks my heart more than some of the tragedies, because I just detect so much black comedy in the tragedies. And then the Tempest is the one that really gets under my skin, especially with everything that's happened in my family. I just like it. It kind of scares me in a way, that play. Working on it.
It does. It really does investigate the fragility of life, right? Yeah. It's that we're all well, such stuff as dreamers made on, right? But we're all mortal. Right. And the fact that there's always that thing, isn't it, that because it was potentially Shakespeare's final piece, right? That there is that kind of bow being put on there, this kind of swan song of what he's trying to say to the world. What I find, there's something in what you said about flat comedy in the tragedies, right? And I always remember what the playwright Alan Ayckbourn said, which is, if you're directing or experiencing a tragedy, you must always find the comedy in it.
I totally agree.
Because the tragedy will speak for itself.
Yes.
But then it's the opposite effect with comedy. And in comedy, the comedy should, if it's a good written comedy, the comedy should speak for itself. So you have to find the drama in it, because if you're highlighting the drama, then you're giving the audience a real meal, as it were. And I remember when you and I talked about Twelfth Night, right? And the recent YouTube broadcasting of the National Theatre's Twelfth Night from 2017, I think, or 2018, where Malvolio was changed to Malvolia. And in that production, they had specifically chose to focus on the melancholy and the tragedy of Malvolia at the end. I thought it was astonishing. I thought it was so powerful that I had never seen that play done that way before. I thought it was wonderful.
I totally agree. And in fact, I think perhaps the reason why The Tempest intimidates me as it does is because I see it as the ultimate example of what I actually love most about Shakespearean comedies, which is how melancholy and mournful they can be. My favorite Shakespearean comedy, and probably one of my favorite plays in the world, say what you will about taste, is Love's Labour's Lost. I love it with my whole heart. I can recite it from memory. I love that stupid, plotless little play. I love it because it is sugared icing until it's not. And the audience has to confront the reality of death and sorrow and responsibility at the same time and in the same way that the leading characters do. The 8 courtiers, all 8 of them are so privileged and so elite and so wrapped up in themselves that it takes death. It takes an actual death of a parent to make them realize how coarse feeling and circumspect they have been in the way they have led their lives, even though they technically run countries, and it should be their job to be sort of working for their citizens, and instead they have been mocking them, and it ends on this just like gorgeously ambivalent and melancholy note. And of course I see, and then the other play, my other favorite comedy, which I think is Shakespeare honing that later in his career, is Twelfth Night, right? Which despite many productions has a quite, grayscale, melancholy, bittersweet ending. And then I think Shakespeare takes that and then he refines it even further when he gets to the end of his career and he does Tempest. I think that those 3 plays are like speaking to one another and they are improving on each other. And for me, I feel like at this point in my career and in my life, I'm in a Love's Labour's Lost phase. I hope I am anyway. I hope I live long enough that this is the Love's Labour's Lost phase. And I think as I get older and as I get more mature, I will move into the Twelfth Night phase. And then someday, when I'm ready to step away, I will do Tempest. But I see all 3 of them as like fundamentally linked. They're just representing Shakespeare's questioning of what a comedy is and where the sorrow is in comedy. He's just questioning it at 3 different points, and it's getting more and more deep and rich and mature as he goes along. That's how I read those.
I love how you describe it. No, I love how you describe yourself into different phases. I'd never thought of it like that, because I think I've always probably been a messenger or like a spear carrier to the left or something, or I think, or either been Stefano or Trinculo or one of the comic characters, or what's his name? Touchstone, of course. That's a good question. I don't know which phase I'm in at all. But there's a certain talking about the kind of US UK bridge, I guess. There is a certain idolizing of Shakespeare naturally because he was native to this country. But I think we've done him justice in this country in being able to serve what he might have. We'll never fully know what he intentionally purposed, right? Because he's dead now, right? But I think we've done quite well to serve traditional aspects of those plays as well as radically reform them, which I think is all you can ask for of any playwright. And it's wonderful that beyond Shakespeare now there are certain other playwrights where we can start doing that. A couple of years ago I saw a terrific production of Pygmalion by George Bernard Shaw, which was, I think for the first time, was a production which really radically changed that play and introduced more technological elements to it. And that was produced by, I think it was Cheek by Jowl. And I can't wait for the day where we can start doing that to people like Samuel Beckett and Ionesco and
Pinter.
Yeah, I don't know. Brecht possibly as well, and where we can radically rechange those things. And it's, in a way, it's a privilege that we can do that with Shakespeare because of the fact that we've rediscovered Shakespeare in the sense that we can reinterpret him.
Yeah, I would totally agree, and I think that is a beautifully ambivalent and melancholy note to leave our interview on, if we're going to be fully Shakespearean about this. So, Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. It's just been a joy. Really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. It's been a joy. Thank you for inviting me as well.
Okay, everyone, play us out.